The fried liver attack might look dangerous, but in reality, it's one of the worst choices your opponent can make against you. Once you learn this counterattack, you'll never be afraid of the fried liver attack again. In fact, you'll even start hoping your opponent plays it. So yeah, no messing around. I'm Philip. Let's jump right in. e4, e5, knight to f3, attacking the pawn on e5, knight to c6, defending it, bishop to c4, that's the Italian opening, and here you play knight to f6. Now in this position, what actually turns this into the fried liver attack is knight to g5, because it comes with an immediate threat against the pawn on f7. White is basically hoping you mess up here. For example, by playing h6, try to chase the knight away. And then you're already in big trouble because after knight takes f7, you can't capture that knight since the bishop is defending it, and now you're getting forked on the rook and the queen, so you're going to have to save one of the two. So I'm going to show you the correct way to defend this, and also a really aggressive line where you can punish anyone who goes for it, which will definitely knock your opponent out of their prep. Let's start with the correct way first. Here, the strongest defense is d5, because with this move, you basically shut down the bishop that's aiming at f7, so now the knight can't take anymore. And if white captures with the bishop here, you're already basically winning since you have knight takes the bishop, uncovering an attack on the knight on g5. Then after pawn takes, queen takes g5, pawn takes the knight, you capture on g2 with tempo. White loses the right to castle, and you're also going to pick up that pawn on c6, ending up in a position that's completely winning for you. So here's the thing. In this position, if your opponent captures with the pawn, the strongest move is knight to a5. And if you don't know this line, a lot of players usually go for control of d5, which is a mistake and actually leads to a bad position for you. And if you've already fallen for this and lost games after knight to d5, pay close attention because the correct move is counterintuitive. It's b5. This move catches a lot of unprepared opponents because it goes against the instinct to recapture right away, but it's actually what keeps you in the game. Most opponents will capture on b5 because it looks like the simplest move, and even then, it's a really serious mistake for white, because after queen takes d5, you're hitting the bishop and the pawn on g2 at the same time, and possibly even the rook. So once they notice that threat, they usually capture the knight on c6, the queen recaptures the bishop while keeping pressure on g2. White castles, and then we follow up with bishop to b7. And now you can really see why sacrificing the pawn on b7 with that advance was so powerful, because now we're threatening checkmate on g2, and that definitely puts your opponent under pressure, since even though white can stop it for a moment, they can't really hold up against your attack. Now, this hold on, let me rephrase that. This continuation is important, and I'll come back to it later, but just to respect your time, let me first show you what actually happens in practice in the vast majority of games when you reach this position. And this is exactly where a lot of people mess up, because for a long time, people thought the best way to play was just to capture that pawn on d5 with the knight. But nowadays, that's not the main line anymore, since white can still keep the attack rolling by sacking the knight on f7. That knight sack actually works, because once you take it, you don't really have a better option than capturing the knight, since it's forking the queen and the rook. And after that, the attack keeps going with queen to f3 check. You can't block this check because the knight is pinned, and if you move the king back either to e8 or to g8, you end up losing the knight anyway. And in some lines, like this possible continuation, you just get checkmated. So your only real option is to keep your king in the pin and walk into the center of the board, where white is going to have the better position. And even though you can still defend, white has a ton of attacking options. They can go knight to c3, putting pressure on that pin. Then pretty quickly, they're going to castle and bring a rook over to e1. So to avoid dealing with all of that, these days you don't take the pawn on d5 with the knight anymore. Instead, black plays knight to a5, hitting the opponent's bishop and basically shutting down this whole attacking idea. Here, white can still hold on to the extra pawn by playing bishop to b5 check. You block the check with a pawn, and after a pawn takes on c6, you recapture with the pawn, which is protected by the knight. White can even try to keep things going with a little tactical shot playing queen to f3. So what's the point? If you take the bishop on b5, you're losing the rook. So you've got to play this in-between move with rook to b8, the bishop drops back to e2, and then you play bishop to e7. So yes, you've sacked a pawn and you're down a pawn, but you've got a super active attacking position, and you didn't get hit by anything concrete. Your opponent is going to have a lot of chances to mess up, and for example, after both sides castle, they're going to have to reposition that knight because it's way too advanced and doesn't have much support. So they offer a knight trade on e4, and you just take it. You end up with some initiative since white's pieces aren't really developed yet, and this is considered one of the correct ways to defend against the opponent's attack. Another really common option for white after you play pawn to b5 is to just grab the knight on c6. And if white does that, you take the bishop and end up with the bishop pair. And that pawn on c4 is actually kind of annoying, because it really messes with white's development. If they try to castle, then you just go pawn to h6, taking the knight out. If the knight drops back to f3, you keep chasing it with pawn to e4. And now the knight barely has any active squares. Usually they try rook to e1, pinning the pawn, but that doesn't really help much. You just play bishop to e6, shut the file down, and the knight has to move again. If the knight wants to stay in the center and goes to e5, you hit it once more with bishop to d6. And now you can really see how many extra tempi you've gained just by chasing that knight around. And as you can see, at this point, it only has d7 left. And let's be honest, it's not going to last there for very long. And here we get a really beautiful continuation. You play bishop takes h2, a classic Greek gift for your opponent, and this just wins the game. You invite the king to take the bishop, then comes knight to g4, check, with the idea of bringing the queen to h4. For example, king to g1, queen to h4, and the whole idea is to set up this triangle of checks that leads straight to a win. And if your opponent thinks they still have the f1 square and plays some random move, you just keep going. Queen to f2 check, king to h1, queen to h4, king to g1, queen to h2, king to f1, queen to g1, king to e2, and finally queen to g2, checkmate. Now, I want to show you an aggressive way to punish anyone who tries to use this attack against you. So let's go. In this position, you basically say, go ahead, play the fried liver attack, I dare you. And then you play knight takes e4. And you might be thinking, wait a second, this doesn't even defend the pawn on f7, and on top of that, looks like you're just hanging a piece for free. How does that work? So let's see what happens if your opponent actually takes the piece, because that's what he thinks is going on. Here, you can play d5, and that's a fork that gets your piece back. If, for example, white takes the pawn on d5, you just recapture normally. And even though you don't really have a material advantage, you do have better central control, more development than your opponent, and overall a really comfortable position to play. And if after the fork he pulls the bishop back to d3, you capture the knight, then he goes bishop takes e4. But at this point, you've already knocked your opponent out of preparation. And you actually come out of the attack better than he does. We can see that capturing the knight just isn't an option for white. And what if they keep pushing the attack on f7 with the knight? Well, that's where you get a ton of counterplay after queen to h4. Now, what's the idea behind this move? First of all, you're threatening checkmate on f2, so if your opponent just keeps grabbing material, you win the game. Simple as that. And if he tries to stop the checkmate with something like g3, you just take the pawn on g3, and here you're basically winning. First, because you're attacking the rook, and he can't take back with the h-pawn, otherwise the rook drops with check. And if he takes with the f-pawn instead, you go queen to e4 check, and that ends up winning your opponent's rook. So you can see this is a really aggressive line, packed with tactics and some nasty tricks you can use. But hold on, we're still not done yet. If your opponent castles, you just keep going and playing knight takes f2. No mercy at all. Because after the rook takes back, you've got bishop to c5, and now you're threatening to take the queen with check. The best defense your opponent's got here is queen to f3, and then you just follow up with rook to f8, pinning the knight, and from there you're basically winning. So let me show you something here. Even when queen to h4 gets defended in the best possible way, which is queen to e2, you still keep a pretty big edge by continuing with knight to d4, hitting the queen. The best reply there is pawn to g3, attacking the queen and basically forcing a queen trade. And after that whole sequence of captures, the knight drops back to d4, and now all of a sudden, there's a fork threat on c2. Your opponent doesn't get scared and keeps grabbing your rook, but then you land the fork, and on the very next move, you're taking their rook right back. Now, in this position, you might be wondering, all right, but what if I get paired up against Nakamura? What's the most accurate way for him to try to defend this, and how am I supposed to keep going? So the most precise way for white to play here is to capture on f7 with the bishop, not with the knight, and after you move the king, white's gotta play pawn to d4. Anything else is basically gonna let you stabilize the position. So why is pawn to d4 such a strong move? Because now you can't take the knight on g5 anymore. If you do take that knight, white just recaptures with the bishop, and by the end of the line, they're winning your queen. But even if your opponent gets it right and realizes they're supposed to take with the bishop, if they don't follow it up with d4 and instead play basically anything else, like grabbing your knight on e4, you just keep going and take the bishop on h7. Then comes queen to f3 check, you just step back to e8, and you're totally fine. The position's super comfortable to play. And just like that, you've completely shut down all of white's ideas of trying to win the game quickly without having to deal with any real fried liver attack. Alright guys, that's it. I hope... No, wait. Actually, one more thing. Let me show you. I just remembered. So, as promised, let me take you back to that really dangerous line white can try if you don't handle this the right way. Because in this position, they've got a few options to deal with the threat of checkmate on g2. So the move you're going to see most often here is pawn to f3. Correct follow-up is pawn to h6. The whole idea is to target the knight and gain some important tempo. And honestly, as you've seen in almost every line we've covered, that knight on g5 just keeps giving us a ton of extra development time. In this line, I'm going to recommend castling long, because right away, you're putting a rook on a semi-open file facing the queen and making it super active. On top of that, the bishop can come to c5 and start hitting those weakened dark squares around the king. Black's position just works really well overall, and white honestly doesn't have a clean way to fight back against it. So after h6, the knight is forced to retreat back to h3, since e4 is completely under control. And here, once again, you want to punish anyone who tries this fried liver attack against you. So you go g5, g4, just keep pushing and keep the attack going. The whole idea is to blow the position open so you can deliver checkmate on g2. And you already know how this goes. When someone's under this kind of non-stop aggressive pressure like we're putting on here, the chances of them making a mistake increase significantly. So the real question is, how was white even supposed to deal with this? So white goes knight to f2 because pawn to g4 was already a threat. But honestly, you just go g4 anyway. And now what's white supposed to do? If they take on g4, that just leads straight to checkmate. Since they can't take, they try knight to c3, but that doesn't really fix anything. So now you grab one f3 and your opponent goes queen to f3, hoping that trading queens is going to shut the attack down. But you don't back off, you trade anyway. And after the trade, you go rook to g8, check. Whites who try to block with the knight, but then you push h5 and the attack just keeps coming. And at this point, white's basically got to dump a ton of material just to avoid getting mated on the spot, which means they're already in a lost position. And if white doesn't want to give up material and plays king to h1 instead, then it's just bishop takes f3 checkmate. But look, all of this only really turns into a win if you understand that the fried liver attack isn't some isolated thing. At first, I thought I had it completely figured out until I started getting hit by other early attacks for the exact same reason. That's why you gotta click the video that's popping up on your screen right now, where I show how I refuted the scholar's mate, and once you really get that, it actually turns into another attack I love seeing people try against me. If you only learn how to shut down the fried liver but ignore the scholar's mate, you're going to stay vulnerable anytime someone goes for early attacks in the opening. So click it now, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.